This morning, we know that there are those that are traveling, those that are sick. We want to remember them in our prayers too this morning as we continue our study in Genesis chapter 39. Technically, we're supposed to pick up at around the 12th verse. And with the story of Joseph being sold into Egyptian slavery and Potiphar's and those things and events, we're quite familiar with that. We have studied that quite often. We use it quite often in examples and preaching, and I think most all of us are well acquainted with that story, so we're probably going to move pretty rapidly through the next few chapters of this study. One of the things that I'm going to use, though, as a kind of a review is when we first went to talking about Joseph a few weeks ago, when he was 17 years old, we find his brother sold him off. We did a handout, Joseph, a picture of Christ, and I'm going to just use this handout just briefly to use it for a review to show that picture, because we have been looking at types and shadows in these things. We see that one of the first things that we notice is that divine providence overruled the envy of his brothers. In the end, Joseph came out on top. God had blessed him through all the trials and situations that he was in. And I'm not going to give them the many passages of Scripture for the constraint of time. We see that divine providence overruled the wickedness of the Jews in the life of Jesus. So God was with Joseph, God was with Jesus. Joseph was Jacob's beloved son. And we find that he thought a lot of Jacob did, and it created a problem, within the life of his brothers. And they envied Joseph. That's why they done that, and they sold him. We find that Jesus was God's only begotten son. He too was envied by the Jewish rulers. And so we find it was because of envy that they had him delivered unto Pilate. Joseph was sent on a mission of mercy. We know his father had sent him down to check on his brethren that were feeding the flock in Dothan. And so we find that Jesus was sent on a mission of mercy. His mission of mercy was a little deeper than that of Joseph. His mission of mercy was salvation. Joseph was rejected by his brethren. And we talked about that in a few bullet points above. Jesus was rejected by his own people because of the same thing, this envy. Joseph was hated because of his dreams of exaltation. So Joseph, as we talked about it, told his brothers about the dreams that he had been dreaming and about how they would serve him, that he would become their master. We find that Jesus was hated because he claimed to be a king. And it was a kingdom that was misunderstood by the world. Joseph, we find, was stripped of his coat of many colors. Jesus, we find, was stripped of his garments. Joseph was sold for 20 pieces of silver. Jesus was sold for 30 pieces of silver. And it seems like when you look at that, since he was sold into Egyptian slavery at that time, dealing with Potiphar's and the Ishmael caravan, you have to take it that was the price of a slave at that time. Just as 30 pieces of silver in the time of Jesus was roughly the price of a slave. Joseph's brethren thought they had got rid of him when they sold him off into Egyptian captivity. Jesus' enemies thought they had got rid of him when they crucified him. We find that later Joseph's brethren had to face him, and we'll get into that shortly in Genesis chapter 42. His brethren had to face him. We find that the enemies of Jesus had to face the facts of the resurrection. Now, of course, if you take that to the next level, one day the enemies of Jesus have got to face him at judgment. So we can see a lot in that. Joseph's brethren lied about what happened to him. They told Jacob that maybe some wild beast had come and killed him, so they lied about that. We find the enemies of Jesus lied about him. There was false witnesses involved, and they were paid money to lie about the resurrection in Matthew chapter 28. Joseph was tempered and remained pure. Joseph, and we're going to see that today as we're talking about another incident that happened in the life of Joseph. Jesus was tempted and remained pure. Joseph became ruler, inviting his starving brethren. Spiritually, Jesus became ruler and invites the starving world to spiritual food of salvation. Joseph's food was physical to sustain the flesh. Jesus' food is spiritual to sustain the spirit. We find that Joseph forgave his brethren. He forgave his brethren. Jesus forgives and pardons sinners, and we know that when Jesus was on the cross, one of the things that he said to the Father was, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And Joseph gave his people Goshen, which was a prime piece of land and city in Egypt, and it was very prime. That is a shadow and type of heaven for us. And there was more. I think when we done this, we kept adding some to this list back a few weeks ago, and I didn't make the note on it of what we kept adding to it. But anyway, it's a type of shadow that we're seeing. One of the things that we see here with Joseph being sold into Egyptian slavery is he wound up in the house of Potiphar in Genesis chapter 39, who is the captain of the guard. And it's going to be kind of interesting if we get to that when Joseph is put in prison. Because if you turn over and look in verses 3 and 4 of chapter 40, guess who Joseph answered to, and guess who put Joseph in charge of the prison? The captain of the guard. Who was the captain of the guard? There's some things there about Potiphar's wife maybe we haven't thought about or taken notice of, and that maybe even Potiphar himself was aware of, because see, the crime that Joseph, if you will, was alleged to have committed carried the death sentence. Okay? But Potiphar didn't carry out the death sentence. He could have very easily been the captain of the guard. Now, when you go out and look at this and do some research on it, you're going to find some of the historians say that Potiphar not only was the captain of the guard, but he was the chief execution officer too. So the men that were involved in executions answered to Potiphar also. So it sounds like he was what we would call today maybe the prison warden. He was kind of in charge of the whole run. We know a captain, normally in the military, if it's at full strength and all, he'll be under the command of somewhere around, 100 men or so. So we find that Potiphar was a very influential man, and he had a lot of power and authority. So what led up to this imprisonment? Well, we began last week when we talked about that Potiphar's wife began to throw herself at Joseph. Now, historians tell us that Potiphar's wife was a very beautiful woman, and before we understand and we read about Joseph, he was a very handsome young man. And so we find that she took a great interest in Joseph, and Joseph said in verse 9 that he can't do this. There's none greater in this house than I. Potiphar had, in previous verses, has set me up to be a caretaker over all. Neither hath he kept back anything from me, but these. Potiphar had put me in charge of everything. His servants, his maid servants, whatever his investments was, his farming, if he did that, whatever it was, Joseph was over all of it except his wife. Okay? He had no authority over Potiphar's wife. He said, can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? You know, it would be real easy to give into that type of temptation, wouldn't it? I mean, you know, a lot of times the thought pattern with people will go something like this. Well, I'm far away from home. I'm in a strange land. Nobody knows me, and who's going to find out about it? It's kind of like the old statement sometimes you hear, when in Rome, do as the Romans. You know? But what did Joseph say? He said, can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? So Joseph's heart and mind was pictured on the things that was right. And as a side note, some of the things that I didn't bring those notes with me today because I'm going to get into them maybe a little later. But have you noticed something here, a pattern that we're seeing develop that would later become the Ten Commandments? They didn't have the Ten Commandments in. They didn't have the law of Moses. all this was being carried out in the principles of morality and righteousness was being given to these people by God through the heads of households. So where do they get this from? It's kind of interesting, isn't it? About thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Don't you think about the things that we're going to become that we're already seeing that's building toward that. And that's in something else. But when you see this, just think about this now. Where did Joseph get this installation in his life about I can't do this sin? Well, he had to get it from his father, didn't he? And his father had to get it from his father, who got it from where? From God. God was working with these heads of households, instilling these principles of righteousness. And I don't know if we stop and think about that sometimes when we study this Old Testament and we begin to look at what's being built here. Genesis is the foundation being laid toward the old law, which is a foundation that's being laid toward the new. And it's all coming through Jesus Christ. It's kind of interesting when you stop and think about it. We're going to break out some of the things that we've already seen in the events of the lives of these people that later on are going to become the law of Moses. So we're seeing that being built here. We're actually seeing it carried out. But anyway, Joseph said he couldn't do this, and it came to pass, verse 10, how she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or even be with her. And it came to pass about that time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. Now you have to wonder about that. Sounds like to me there was a very busy household with a great number of servants there. Joseph is refusing to lie with Potiphar's wife. On this particular day, after much refusal, wasn't nobody there but him and her. Well, what are all that? You have to ask yourself a question if this was not something that was contrived and manipulated to be put together to set that in motion by her. If you'll stop and look at it, if you read the prior events that's going on here. There was a lot of activity going on here for there to be nobody around. And so it said, and it came to pass, there was none of the men there in verse 12 where we're supposed to pick up. And she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. Boy, it's a powerful, powerful statement right there in verse 12. That's a powerful lesson right there. Notice what it says here. And she caught him by his garment. The trap had snared him, hadn't it? I mean, he was like, but you know, God provided the way out, didn't he? He slipped out of that outer coat, didn't he? That outer covering he had would easily come off, and we've seen pictures of that, of how those outer garments were kind of loose fitting so they would be cool and light. But the trap had caught him, hadn't it? The trap had been sprung. And yet we find that Joseph left his garments. You know, he left that outer coat. You know, back then these coats and things that these people wore and these outer coverings and stuff were prized possessions, just not like today. I mean, if you had an outer garment, you took care of it because you probably wouldn't get another one for a while if you ever did in your lifetime, because they were scarce. It's not like today that you could run to Walmart or JCPenney, grab something, and go. It wasn't like that back then. These were prized possessions here when you had these types of garments. But Joseph was willing to give up that garment, his worldly possession. And if you stop and think about it, Joseph had a lot while he was here in Egypt in Potiphar's house, no doubt. But it didn't belong to him. So whatever he had on his back when he went down there, that's what he had. That was his own personal possession. So, you know, it wasn't something to be taken lightly to leave your outer garment at this period of time. And notice what it says here, and he fled and got him out. He fled. And that's an interesting statement that you find. You find this used several times in the Bible, to flee. And so we find when we look at, let's look in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. and verse 18. I think we looked at that very briefly. 1 Corinthians chapter 6. In verse 18, what it's talking about here is there's the sanctity of the body. And he goes on to tell you about members of Christ being joined to a harlot, God forbid, in verse 15. What, know ye not, he that is joined to a harlot is one body, for the two saith he shall be one flesh. But he that is joined unto the Lord is one spirit. Notice verse 18. This has kind of been fascinating. It's only two words and a period. So it's put there to make us stop. And that's what a period means. When you read a sentence, you know, you usually stop and pause before you start the next part of the sentence. Notice what it says here. Flee fornication, period. That's pause. So that's put there to make us stop and think about the verbiage that's in that sentence or statement. And in this particular setting, it's only two words. To flee fornication. Joseph fled. 1 Corinthians 10:13. Let's see what that says.
That's good. 10:13 will tell you something.
There hath no temptation taken you such as common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that which you are able. But with temptation also make a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. So God here has created a way of escape from this temptation. I mean, when you stop and think about it, the claws were hooked, wasn't they, on the outer garment. I mean, that would have been real easy to have gave in at that point.
That's a perfect example between Potiphar's wife and Joseph. That's a perfect example of what 1 Corinthians 10:13 is talking about.
Sure.
Sure. It was with the temptation that God made a way of escape.
Okay. That's right.
But up there when he walked in that room and there wasn't nobody there, no men and nobody, but just him and her, that was a test for Joseph.
That's
then
right.
he was being put to a test.
Yeah. And all this was leading up to him being tempered for the job at hand. You know, that was good. There was a bigger picture here, and God was preparing Joseph mentally and spiritually for a larger task. And so we find that, as Brother Con said, the temptation, that was a way of escape. We find 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22 talks about flee you for lust.
Yeah.
So when the Bible says flee fornication in the New Testament, I have it on good account. If you have to run, you need to run. Okay?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you. When you might as well think of it too, like you said, use that expression. I noticed you use that a lot. You think of how it might have been in their mind
Right.
at that time.
Right.
That they anticipated something like that. You always expect the devil to try to trap you.
Right.
You know that. You got it in anticipation.
Right.
So if you are thinking of it like that, then you can say, well, here it is.
Yeah, there it is.
Now it's up to me.
Yeah. What am I going to do?
Yeah, it's done fell on me now to handle it.
Yeah. And so we find in verse 13, it came to pass when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth. Now can you picture this? She's done grabbed him. He's come out of the outer garment, and she's standing there holding the garment. Where's Joseph? He done fled.
Thinking of a lie. Thinking about a lie all the time.
There you go. That's where I was headed. That's where I was headed with that. Holding that garment, thinking about, what kind of story am I going to concoct now? And that she called unto the men of her house, and spake unto him, saying, See, he hath brought us a Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass, when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment out with me and fled and got him out. And she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home. Just like Brother Con said, concocted that lie. So, she knew where these men in the house was, because no doubt she's probably the ones that sent them out. Because when she saw this situation, what did she do? she went to crying for the men of the house, didn't she? She called unto them. Didn't say cried, did it? She called unto them. It's almost like, Robert, Sam, come here. You know? So you can start seeing that this whole thing was a concocted trap, and she thought up these falsehoods in a hurry. Slanderous falsehoods in general. And notice she didn't even call Joseph by name. She didn't even think he was worthy enough at this time to be called by name. See, look at this Hebrew you brought to us. You know, that's a put down within itself. You know, to not even recognize who he was now. And you know, it's kind of like what we see with a lot of the Sadducees and things like that. You know, they really didn't want to call Jesus by name. This man said these blasphemous words. It's almost they didn't recognize any type of humanity toward him. And so, but this is the way these things work very often, isn't it? Let's see, Psalms chapter 31. Let's see what's there. Psalms chapter 31. Where am I at? Psalms chapter 31, verse 13. Oh, here we have David praising God for his deliverance, and he exhorts others to praise him too. And here's one of the things that David said, beginning in verse 11. First he said, I was a reproach among all mine enemies, but especially among my neighbors, and a fear to mine acquaintance that they did not see me without fled from me. So Job's talking about being reproached here by his enemies, even amongst his neighbors. I am forgotten as a dead man out of mind. You know, in a way, the way she was speaking about Joseph, she considered him a dead man, this Hebrew. Because she knew the power and authority that her husband had, and this thing did carry with it back then the death penalty, okay? For I have heard the slander of many. And this is what she did. Fear was on every side. You know, Joseph ran out being a slave there. You know, no doubt there was some fear and concern in his heart about, you know, what's going to happen now. While they took counsel together against me, they devised to take away my life. You know, this was something she devised and planned. She schemed, didn't she? But notice what happens here though. But I trusted in thee, O Lord. I said, thou art my God. My times are in thy hand. Deliver me from the hand of my enemies and from them that persecute me. We could go on and on. So we can see an example of this 31st Psalm being played out in the life of Joseph, because he is an upright and righteous man. And so we find that she spake to the Lord in verse 17, the Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came in unto to mock me. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out. You know, this Hebrew servant came to mock me. It came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment. Notice how she distorted the facts. It's very subtle, but when you see it, she's not telling the account the way it happened. If you look at that, it looks as if she's telling it like he had pulled his garment off while I was crying and screaming. And he left, and his garment is laying here. That's not what happened, is it? That's not what happened. If you go and look at that, if you go back and look at it, that's not what happened. He left his garment with me, and notice she said, I lifted up my voice and crying. So she made out like she was crying and screaming. Well, there's a problem with that statement. If she was already crying and screaming when he pulled his garment off, when she called the men of the house, they must have been within shouting distance. Why didn't they come when she was crying and screaming? See what happens here? It's kind of interesting, isn't it, Daniel? At the way people will manipulate and distort the facts of things. And so we find that it came to pass when his master heard these words of his wife, which he spake unto him, saying, after this manner did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. So we find that she told this And, you know, this guy Potiphar stirred up about what had went on. I want to put a little bit different thought pattern in this thing. Now, Potiphar was captain of the guard, right? And he may have had more authority than that if we listen to what some of the historians say, that also entailed him being the captain over the execution staff, okay? But that's historian. We know he was captain of the guard, okay? Why did Potiphar not put him to death? You know, when you stop and look at this, maybe Potiphar was aware of more than what he's given credit for. Potiphar could see that Joseph was an upright man. He's never had any problems with Joseph taking anything. Nothing's ever mentioned of Joseph ever trying to take anything that Potiphar had. Potiphar prospered. He didn't even have to go and check on Joseph while he was entertained. And now this event comes up. So it makes you wonder what Potiphar is really thinking about his wife. Because when you look down through here, his wrath was kindled. Sure, he was upset that it happened. Sure, he was probably upset at Joseph. But did Potiphar know too, in this wrath, what he was dealing with? Because I want you to notice something. And Joseph's master took him, put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners was bound, and he was there in prison. So he did take him. He did put him in prison. That's something because of the circumstances and situation, no doubt that he had to do. Okay. No mentions ever uttered the word, well, I'll have this man killed for this. Another factor in this too was God was using this event to further temper Joseph's disposition and strengthen his faith. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So we're going to find that because Joseph did that which was right, even though he's suffering for that which is right. You know, sometimes people say, well, the truth will set you free. Yeah, it'll set you free, but that don't mean that you're free from the consequences that may go with the truth. It may relieve your conscience. And if you look at it from the point of salvation, it will save your soul. But a lot of times, that which is right, there's consequences to be had. And so it was with Joseph. You know, it seems very unfair and very unjust, doesn't it? It sure does. Yeah.
Where was Joseph when Potiphar come home? I mean, he could have fled and gone.
Yeah, he fled, but he was somewhere around because Potiphar arrested him and put him in prison.
Yeah.
So undoubtedly, that's a good point. He didn't look like he went far, did he?
Yeah, he was right there somewhere, so that would kind of
Yeah.
show Potiphar what Joseph was thinking.
Right, yeah. So there's a lot of questions when you examine this real closely about Potiphar's wife. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was a doer of it. Well, wait a minute. I thought this guy was such a hardened criminal and such a pervert and had assaulted my wife. That was the end of it. A lot of questions here, isn't it? You got to be wondering, what is Potiphar really thinking about this thing? You know? What is he thinking about his wife? What's he thinking about Joseph? You know, were there other incidences that had maybe cropped up in times past? There's a big question mark here, if you really stop and look at it and examine it. I'm going to jump on over into verse 40 because I want to get down here to what we talked about in verses 3 and 4. And it came to pass after these things, chapter 40, that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was wrath against two of his officers, against the chief of the butler and against the chief of the baker. He put them in prison. Okay? And we know the story of the chief baker and the chief butler and about what happened there in prison. They're going to dream dreams, and Joseph's going to interpret those dreams, and we're going to find the butler's going to be restored and the baker's going to be killed a very hideous death because the bird's going to eat his flesh. But the butler forgot about Joseph. Well, what was this that involved this thing that they offended their Lord, King of Egypt? Well, the Bible doesn't really tell us what offended him. Generally, when it talks about the chief butler, that's in reference to the chief cupbearer to the king. In other words, he's the one that brought the drink and things like that to the king, okay? Being the chief cupbearer. That's the king's, maybe it was a golden chalice he drank out of or whatever, I don't know. Yeah, but whatever it was, he was in charge of it. The chief baker had to do with his baking of bread, his food. You know, that would probably be our way of saying the chief chef. Whatever happened here, it offended Pharaoh. Now, I'll jump back into what some historians say about this account, that Pharaoh had gotten suspicious because there were some poisonings that had been going on within his rulership. Some of the sub-leaders had been taken out through that, and there's some thought here that maybe these men had been accused of trying to poison the king. Now, I'll leave that with the historians, okay? Something went on there, didn't it, to cause them to be thrown into prison, okay? But notice this, and what I really want to get to is right here. And he put them in the ward in the house of the captain of the guard, into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them. Who's it keep referring to here? The captain of the guard. The captain of the guard. The keeper of the prison. Well, who was this? If we reference it back, we find that the Bible tells us, and Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard. So it seems to look like that Potiphar put him in this ward, but it was Potiphar that gave him charge over the prison. So what was he thinking here about this event? To go from being here over all this in the household, and it was very prosperous and everything ran like a clock. This event where my wife come up, I've got to take some action. I put him in prison, but I turn right around, Brother Con, oh, by the way, you over the whole operation running. Make you wonder, did it, Daniel? What actually went on there with that? What did Potiphar really know about his wife? What was that event there? And we know God's hand was in this to carry out his plan. We know God was with Joseph. We're going to find that repeated over and over, that God was with him. And notice what it says in verse 23. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand. Didn't he check on him? Joseph, you in charge of it, take off. Read, that's what you call a daily inmate running to prison, didn't it? But look what kind of inmate he was, right?
He knew what he did with his household, so he knew
Yeah.
what to do there.
Yeah. So, you know, it does leave some unanswered questions, though, about his wife, doesn't it? It sure does. It sure does. And Joseph prospered. And so we find that they were in the ward together. Joseph was overseeing them. And that's something else. These two guys here of questionable character in the minds of Pharaoh. Pharaoh gives them to the captain of the guard, who gives them to Joseph. So anyway, and they dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream. The butler, the baker of the king of Egypt, which was bound in prison. So these men were had dreams that were going on in their life, and we know that at this time that God used dreams very often, both to his patriarchs, the heads of household, but he also used dreams to the heathen world, didn't he? To reveal unto them actions and things of that nature. As a matter of fact, I'm going to kind of skip a little bit here. God spoke to them in dreams. There's many passages of this where he spoke to the patriarchs, the fathers in dreams, but he also spoke to the heathen world in dreams for his will to be carried out. God spoke to the pagan ruler Abimelech in a dream in Genesis chapter 20. Remember that about Abraham? And Abimelech said, wait a minute now, Abraham's done lied to me. God spoke to Jacob in dreams, one of the patriarchs, didn't he? God spoke to Laban in a dream. Okay? God spoke to the Midianite in a dream in Judges chapter 7. God spoke to Solomon in a dream. God spoke to Nebuchadnezzar in a dream. God spoke to Daniel in a dream. He spoke to Joseph in a dream. He spoke to Pilate's wife in a dream. Have nothing to do with this man. And if you kind of look at it, and it seems as though he spoke almost twice as much to the heathen world in a dream than he did to the patriarchs in a dream. So it's not unusual for God to deal with the empires of the world in such a way to carry out his will. Even though we know they're not true followers of God, he uses this to carry out his will, just like today. He uses government to carry out his will. And I think we often don't stop and think about that, that the powers that be were put there by God, just like it was with Nebuchadnezzar. Wouldn't have a kingdom if it wasn't for God. Although Nebuchadnezzar was not a godly man. But he was used to carry out the will of God. Doctors and nurses today do what? They carry out the will of God, don't they? Are they all, in the strictest sense, Christians? No. God uses people whether they know it or not, whether they realize it or not. He uses them to carry this out. And this was his way then of communicating with them, was through these dreams. And Joseph came into them in the morning and looked upon them and said, behold, they were sad. He asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of the Lord's house, saying, wherefore look ye so sadly today? Now this shows something about Joseph's mind. It shows something about Joseph's heart. Maybe today, if we were in a prison like that, and in the situation we were in, and you had the chief baker, the chief butler, and these men in there, we would probably say to ourselves, this ain't none of my business. I'm staying out of it. But Joseph noticed there was something about them, that their countenance was not like it normally was. He wanted to know what was going on. He wanted them to confide in him, even though he was in a bad situation himself. He wanted them to confide in him. That kind of shows you something about the heart and mind that Joseph had. A sense of compassion, isn't it? Shows you kind of like the compassion that Christ had, doesn't it? The concern for others more than for self. And this is in a bad situation. And so we find that in verse 8, and they said unto him, we have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. So Joseph tells them there is an interpretation. There is an interpreter. God knows these dreams because he's the one that gives them. He said, why don't you tell me about them, and let's see if we can figure this thing out. And so we find the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream, behold, a vine was before me. And in the vine were 3 branches. And it was as though it budded, and her blossom shot forth, and the cluster thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And so we find that this dream, figurative in nature, and then we know that most of the time when these things were done, this revelation was given. It was given in parables, earthly things, so men could have some sense of understanding and relate it to other men. And this is what he done. And so we find Joseph said in verse 12, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head and restore thee unto thy place, and thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hands, after the former manner which thou wast his butler. So Joseph interprets a dream, and it's a positive dream, isn't it? You know,
Back
after
to
3,
your old job, we're gonna put you back to work.
yeah, we're gonna put you back to your old job as cook.
Doing what you used to do.
Yeah, yeah. Which was a good message. That was a good sermon, wasn't it? And I'm about to stop here in just a minute. But Joseph was not a one-sided interpreter. You know, a lot of times you hear one-sided preaching, don't you? It's always about the positive and the good and all like this, and everybody feels good about what they're doing, and the sin they in, it makes them feel, okay, everything's all right. Joseph did not interpret that way. We're going to find Joseph also interpreted the bad, didn't he? The consequences of that which would turn out to be evil, didn't he? So to say that Joseph was a balanced interpreter would probably be an understatement, wouldn't it? And I'm going to stop right there. I don't want to go any further. We've got about a minute, but I'm going to go ahead and ring the buzzer and we'll get ready for the worship service.